Monday. All right. So recording is on. We're going to talk about expanded civil rights. All right. We're going to talk about how and why various groups respond to calls for civil rights from 1960 all the way to 1980. So about a 20-year period. We will talk about the women's rights movement. We're going to talk about gay rights movement. We're going to talk about American Indians and their civil rights movement. And we're going to talk about Hispanics and their civil rights movement. Now, one thing that is different from today's topic than most other ones is there are no formal key points. Instead of a formal key point, what we're going to do is have big section headers. So the first one is going to be the women's movement. And then every piece of info beneath it will follow under there. Then we'll do Hispanic civil rights, which isn't the second one, that's the last one, right? And then every piece will follow in between. So we're just going to have big sections. It's not going to be key point oriented. So early on, right, some milestones for women's rights that we should know already include the Seneca Falls Convention of the 1800s and the Women's Suffrage Bill, the 19th Amendment, right, in the early 20th century. Those are major milestones, major stepping stones. But on top of that, during the World Wars, there was a vast number of women taking the place of men in the workplace, right, in factories and things like that. However, despite doing that, despite doing those jobs and doing them well, they did not enjoy equality with men in the workplace. So keep that in mind. That is still a major factor. So I'll give you about a little less than a minute to get that info down. About 30 seconds. All right, let's move forward. So let's talk about women's role in the 50s. Culturally, women's jobs were to remain in the home, right? Their job was to stay home, make their home something known as a haven of rest. And we've talked about haven of rest before. This is like the cultural norm. But basically, haven of rest means that the home is perfect. It is clean. Everything is ready to go. Husbands and kids don't have to worry about anything. They don't have to do any work. Things like chores weren't a thing because the housewife did all the chores and all the work. The concept of like the husband coming home from work and cooking a meal is like not a thing. The concept of the husband staying home and the woman going to work is not a thing. If you didn't follow these cultural norms in the 50s, you were like shunned. You were considered an outcast. You were ridiculed, you could say. This started to change in 1963 due to the work of Betty Friedan, who wrote this book called The Feminine Mystique. And what this book did is it was a series of interviews that showed the lives of typical housewives in America, and it showed how their lives, this haven of rest lifestyle, became like a prison. That the typical housewife is beholden to their family's needs and not their own. The idea that like if a woman wants to have a day off or go to school instead of be a wife or have a job instead of working in the home all day. Maybe she hates cooking, right? Maybe she hates cleaning. Maybe a woman that didn't want to do these things is still forced to do them. And it's almost like a prison. They're dependent on the needs of their families so much so that they can't take care of their own needs. Hopefully that makes sense. And this book shows that. And it counters the argument of the day. The argument of the day is that women don't want to go to school. They don't want to be educated. They don't want to hold jobs. They want to stay home and do that stuff all day. Yeah, you're not wrong though, Roman. That's the thing. It's fun to laugh at it, but it was the policy, it was what people believe. And this book shows you that that's a ridiculous thing to believe. It showed people during the time that, oh, maybe we were thinking about this the wrong way. She must be a witch. That's a good one. Yeah, she wants to go to school, must be a witch. But that's a thing, like the idea of like, no, girls can't go to school. right? And like if you're a young lady, you weren't encouraged to go to school. You were encouraged to go get married and do all that marriage stuff. And that's not okay. And this book, this Feminine Mystique book, is the first book to kind of show that, oh, for some people, like some people might like living like this, but some people don't. We should at least give them the choice. Inconceivable. Yeah, it's true. That's the thought of the time period, though. And we're going to talk about how women going to school and actually getting educated and stuff, how it actually helps mold a lot of modern stuff, believe it or not. We're pretty modern now, guys. This is not that long ago. Most of y'all's grandparents were probably around during this time. If not your grandparents, your great grandparents. Okay, so I'll give you about a minute or so. Again, this book shows that the argument that women don't want to go to school or be educated is not true. And in fact, women are unable to express their true desires without being ridiculed. So the fact that people think women don't want to go to school, because if women said, hey, I want to go to school, it's like what you're saying, right? Oh, she must be a witch. She wants to go to school. Like it wasn't okay to say you wanted to go to school and be a woman back then in the 50s, that post-war era, right? That atypical era. Like it's so typical and like, what would you say? Not stereotypical, but it's so cartoonish that I literally decided to put a cartoon of it instead of a real picture. Because it's such a caricature of what people are. But that was the belief of the time. So this book is the first step, and then there were more steps. Some that Friedman was a part of, and others that sprouted up because of this. All right, let's go to move forward. So first Title IX and NOW. So Friedman also helped create the National Organization for Women, which is called NOW. They use the same or similar tactics to civil rights leaders seeking equal pay and opportunity and things like that. Equal representation, all that good stuff. Ms. Magazine is a literary piece that helped get changes put out into the public, right? The idea of like, hey, we should change these things, and it's public, right? It's a powerful piece of literature. Magazines back in the day were a big deal. Like having a magazine express yourself is important. That's how you got your message across. Title IX, this is important. You can still feel the ramifications of this stuff today. Ban discrimination based on gender in education and in sports. It should say up to, not at the, up to the college level. Basically, Title IX made it so it was against the law to tell a young woman or a girl they can't go to school. It's also against the law to tell a young girl they can't play sports. And what Title IX does is it lets young women participate in sports and education at levels that is not present across the world. Really quick, yes or no, have any of you guys wondered why the United States, a country that's historically bad at soccer, always wins the women's soccer tournament? Part of it's because the women are amazing athletes, but what do you know another little piece of it? Or can you guess another little piece of it? Because America. Basically, the gist of it is in other parts of the world, women were not allowed to play sports until very, very, very recently. And I'm talking like Western countries, right? Like it wasn't ladylike. It's not what ladies did. But in the United States, because of Title IX, not just because, right? Because again, right before Title IX, not allowed. And Title IX happens relatively early. We have a plethora of female athletes in the United States, more so than in other places, up until very recently. It's why when you think of like dominant female athletes, whether it's like golf, tennis, soccer, basketball, they're all Americans, right? Only nowadays are you getting young women from other countries that are really dominant in sports. Yeah, Serena Williams. Serena Williams is from America, right? She's allowed to do that stuff. In fact, it would be weird if she wasn't, right? So part of it is that young women had the freedom and choice. They have the choice to choose to be in athletics and not be shunned publicly for it, right? If a girl's in sports now, it's not considered unladylike or weird in the United States. And for the most part, nowadays, everywhere that's not the case. Yeah, Serena Williams is a beast. She's the GOAT of tennis, and I don't know anything about tennis, but I know that. But again, so Title IX is the reason why. It's the reason why America makes like dominant female athletes. That's why they're the best in a lot of the sports. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And it's not until the last, I would say maybe 10, 15 years, 20 years, that other countries like in Europe are kind of catching up, kind of. So part of it's just that they're amazing athletes, but another part of it is that the culture, right, the society around the U.S. post 50s, post movements like this one, right, allow for women to participate in sports if they want to and become great and train. I'll give you a quick, little less than a minute on here, and then we'll move on. So yeah, that's called Title IX. And again, it's the same for education. Same for education. Schools cannot say you can't come here because of your gender. All right. About 20 seconds, and then we're going to move on. All right, we're going to go to move forward. We're going to talk about equal rights amendments. So the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, was designed to uphold equal treatment laws for women in the Constitution. The idea that, hey, don't give us special treatment. We want to be treated equal like everybody else. Well, a lady by the name of Phyllis, what would you say, Schlafly? I'm bad with names. Led a campaign called Stop ERA. And this woman wanted to counter the call for equality, which sounds weird, right? That's a weird thing that I'm saying. This woman wanted to counter the call for equality, but she did. She wanted to protect certain benefits. She called them benefits that women had over men. And so because of that, and she was able to counter and prevent an equal rights amendment from being passed. One of the biggest things she'll talk about is like the military draft. Like she was like, no, we don't want to be drafted in the military, like things like that. But she's able to get enough support to stop an equal rights amendment from happening. It almost did, but it never really quite made it. And this is in like the 80s, by the way. This isn't that long ago. I think it's the 80s. Could be, it's either the 70s or 80s. Pretty sure it's the 80s. Yeah, no, it's the 80s. I think that's a Jimmy Carter sign, so it has to be the 80s. About a minute on here, short bit of time. Again, if you guys have questions, let me know. So the last few slides have all been women's rights movement. This next one is as well. But we're going to move forward in a bit and we're going to talk about the next group. But I'll get into that in a bit. About 12 seconds, sorry. And again, if you need more time or you need me to backtrack, let me know. All right, let's move forward. We're talking about the sexual revolution. So this is a part of the counterculture movement. Now we will talk about the counterculture movement tomorrow in more detail. But many women participate in the counterculture movement, and specifically they participate in something known as the sexual revolution. It's a big part of the counterculture movement in the 60s. And what happens is that many Americans' attitudes towards sexuality will change. One of the first things that they'll start doing, this is a little ridiculous, but they use antibiotics to treat STDs. So before the late 50s, early 60s, like if you got an STD, you just walk around with your STD till you die. But now people are using antibiotics to treat these things. Like penicillin, hey, look at that. Also, the use of birth control becomes more common. and casual sex becomes more common, which leads to women wanting more control over their bodies, right, as they should, which leads to the Supreme Court case of Roe versus Wade. Now, Roe versus Wade is a major, major Supreme Court case. It has ramifications to this day. So I want you to write it in as the key term because I didn't put it in the box. I forgot. States could not prohibit women from having abortions within the first 2 trimesters of their pregnancies. This is a federal law. This is done by the Supreme Court, right? They do this based on a woman's right to privacy from the 14th Amendment and its due process clause. So basically, it's illegal for states to prohibit women from having abortions. This is not a current events class. Next year, you will have government where you get to talk about the ways that states try to get around this ruling, but we cannot get too much into it here. So I won't, but it is, yeah, this is a result of counterculture, though. And this is a really important Supreme Court case for the, what would you say, like the civil liberties of women and their control over themselves. Basically, what this movement is, it's like gone are the days that if a woman gets a divorce or wants a divorce, that people like shave her head and shun her in public in the village square. Like those days are gone. And they're not, like they haven't been gone for that long. Like, you know what I mean? This is where they kind of die, this era. The idea of, you know, again, it's called, that's why it's called the sexual revolution. Give you about a minute and a half on here. About 30 seconds. All right, let's go ahead and move forward. So this is a new subheader, American Indians. We're gonna talk about their civil rights movement and how they went about it. Their goals were formalized and created in 1968, and they basically wanted to reclaim their heritage, their cultural tradition, and they wanted to address poverty within their reservations. Alcatraz Island was abandoned by the federal government in the 60s, and a group of Native Americans lived on it in order to like protest their desires, essentially. They wanted their old lands returned, they wanted control over their lands, etc. This will end because the federal government makes it very difficult for these young natives to live on this island. But the message is heard, and by 1975, there will be something known as the Self-Determination Act passed, which gives Native tribes control over their own land, gives them better control over education within their reservations, and law enforcement in the reservation. So if you guys have ever watched, like, they do this in a lot of movies and TV shows where a murder has been committed, right? But it's on the Indian reservation. Well, the only people that can investigate are the tribal police in the Indian reservation, right? And the only like US law enforcement that has authority in those regions are FBI, like federal agents. I tell you that to tell you that that concept of the reservation truly controls their own land and their nation, right? If they want to keep it playing, if they want to distribute it among the people, whatever they do with it, they have control over it, over the legal protection, over the education in the region, over the land. And that is because of the Self-Determination Act of 1975. So again, I'll give you about 2 minutes for this one because there's a lot here. About a minute left on the clock. All right, let's go to move forward. So let's talk about the gay liberation movement. This bar, the Stonewall Inn, was where had a gathering of gay individuals meeting there. And this gathering by itself, being a gathering of gay people, was breaking anti-gay laws in the area. So in 1969, there was a raid called. This is not the only raid of its existence. In fact, raids like this happened all the time. This raid specifically, though, the Stonewall Inn raid, led to organized protests coming out and activism as a result as to call for gays to be open and identify themselves and their own sexual identity. The victory that comes from this raid and from this movement is that in the 70s, homosexuality is changed. So being gay before the 70s used to be considered a mental illness. Post 70s, being gay is now considered a legitimate sexual orientation. It is no longer a mental illness. It is no longer considered such. That doesn't mean people and individuals and the society as a whole is okay with it, but it is a step in the right direction in the sense that it is no longer considered mental illness. It'll still take many years, this fight to continue. This fight still continues on for many years. What was it, 2000, not 8, 12, 2009? That's when the marriage law came into play. Don't quote me on that. Like I said, I'm bad with current events. But that's not quite, you just got to know this first step. I'll give you a quick minute for this info before we move on to the Hispanic Civil Rights Movement, which is the main, another bit that we will talk about. Yeah, it's not no, it's not quite that much. I don't know too much about that particular Swedish incident. I'm pretty sure they just meant felt weird or off, right? Isn't that like the old term for it? There's a bunch of like older English phrases like that that are you would consider inappropriate now that during the time were not meant. Yeah, like he's feeling a little gay or something, and they're referring to feels weird. You can even see it in like old movies, like old 40s and 50s movies, where they do stuff like that. You know, there's nothing negative in the connotation. Like they're not saying it to be mean. They're just kind of using the term before it was like used as a slur or a mean term. There's a lot of that. But that's a minute and a half, so we're going to move forward. So we're going to talk about the Hispanic civil rights movement in a little more detail than normal. I'll kind of show you where generally it ends, and then I'll kind of give you an example of where you can keep going. So the people in the movement, the people that are in these photos, would have considered this the Chicano movement, right? That's what a lot of people called it. But nowadays, you'd probably refer to it as a Hispanic civil rights movement. I'm going to probably fluctuate between the two. I tend to use Chicano a little more because that's what people called it. But the Hispanic civil rights movement lasted a long time. It's been going on for a while, right? Mexican Americans have been coming to the US since the 40s and 50s. Now, traditionally, we used to learn, now, to be fair, this is probably the most undercovered civil rights movement in the US, or one of the anyways, and it shouldn't be, but it is. I don't know why. Honestly, I didn't learn about a lot of these people and this stuff till college. But I want to make sure you guys know at least a little bit about it because it's important. So traditionally, we learned like back in the day that there's 4 main leaders of the Chicano movement, right? But we know that there's actually 5. And the reason that there's 4, that they used to be considered 4, is because Dolores Huerta is always kind of overshadowed by Cesar Chavez because he was like the face of the group. But she was the organizer and the brains behind everything, and she's a major activist and key component of his success as well as her own. So the way I can kind of break it out here, right, is that the 5 is in parentheses. Dolores' name is in parentheses early on, because the term for the leaders of the Chicano movement was the 4 horsemen, right? It's what they kind of referred to themselves as. It's what certain writers refer to them as. But that was like the term for them. But again, there's actually 5, and there's actually 5 main leaders worth naming, right? Rodolfo Gonzalez, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Ruiz Tijerina, and Jose Gutierrez. This is Gonzalez, this is Chavez, this is Huerta, this is Tijerina, and this is Gutierrez. They all operated in their own different regions, and mostly the southwestern United States. These 2 were in California. Gonzalez was in Colorado. Tijerina was in New Mexico, and Gutierrez was in Texas. So basically in parts where there's major Mexican American populations, they each had their own kind of like main civil rights leader person, right? I'll give you about a minute on here. Again, you just really need to get the names down. And we'll get into some details about what they did in a bit. Side note, real quick, yes or no question. You guys know who Juan Seguin is? You guys remember that name? Kind of need him for one of my examples, but if y'all don't remember him, it might not work. Just a quick yes or no, if you guys can do that for me. Juan Seguin. No? Okay. No? Okay. I'll try to explain it a little better then. So if he sounds familiar, it's because he fought at the Alamo, but I'll get into it in a bit. So it's been about a minute, so I'm gonna move forward. The first slide is gonna be the Cesar Chavez Dolores Huerta slide. And it's really where, like, if I was using the AP book and nothing else, right, not bringing in my own historical knowledge, it's where I would stop for this movement. Mexican agricultural workers have been coming to the US since the 40s and 50s, a part of several programs. Now, do you guys remember the names of that program? Like, why were a bunch of Mexican farm workers coming into the US in the 40s? Do you guys know what the name of the program was? Or can you remember what it was? Because we talked about it. No? So the program is called the Bracero program, right? And it was, why was it bringing in, why would the US need a bunch of Mexican farm workers in the 40s? Where were all the other men in the US? Where were all they in 1941, 42, 43, 44, to an extent, 45? What were they off doing? Oh, come on, we gotta know what the men are doing in the 40s. Somebody in the chat, tell me what they're doing. Yep, they're fighting a war. Thank you. So men are fighting a war in the U.S. So we call on all these Mexican farm workers to come in and work. A lot of them stayed, but they're all scattered, disillusioned. A lot of the farm owners, right, a lot of the major agricultural owners in places like California tend to rely on these migrant workers to do a lot of their work for very little pay. And they get very little pay for the most part. Now, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta are able to unite these farm workers in a group called the United Farm Workers, right? The UFW. And this is in 1962, and it's designed to protect their interests. It works kind of like a labor union. Their biggest success was a nationwide grape protest that was very, very effective for them. And by 1970, their efforts were rewarded with increased wages for farm workers. So they're successful. Now, the reason I tend to think that Chavez is the one that's mainly focused on is because, you know, the farm worker movement is a very uniquely Hispanic movement, right? That's what Hispanics did. It's a Mexican-American movement. But on top of that, he protested the way people tend to like, right? He was, him and Huerta did a lot of like peaceful protests, hunger strikes, marches, things like that. Some of the other guys we're going to talk about were a little more militant than that. They were a little more aggressive. They didn't really like the law as much. Not that these people necessarily liked the law, but we're going to get into it. So again, nationwide great protest, big success, big victory for the movement. Now, first guy we're going to talk about is Tijerina. So he was in New Mexico. And so what he's fighting for are land grants that were given to Mexican Americans originally in places all across the Southwest, from Spain or from Mexico or a colonial power essentially, back when these places were colonies. And through various shady, for the most part, reasons, these land grants were ignored, broken, or straight up stolen by Americans. Now, this is not new. This especially happened a lot during the like westward expansion time. It's like 1800s, essentially, right? Is when a lot of this stuff happened, but it happened well into the 20th century to an extent. The reason I asked you guys about Juan Seguin earlier is because he's a guy, he fought at the Alamo, he fought against the Mexican government with Sam Houston. He's a major, major, major Texan, right? He's a Texas revolutionary. He was a Tejano. But later on, as more and more Americans started to come into Texas, they started to kind of dislike him because he was a Mexican. And he will lose his land and be sent to Mexico. Now, I tell you the story of Seguin from like Seguin, Texas, Juan Seguin, to express that Seguin's a war hero. And he got kicked out of Texas for being Mexican, right? He lost all of his land. One of his journal entries, one of the last ones he did is that he basically is like lamenting the fact that I have now been sent to live among my enemies. However will I manage, right? Like the idea that they kicked him out of his home, the place he fought for, people that hadn't fought for, by the way, did this, right? Obviously. And he's now forced to live among people that he fought against his whole life. I tell you that story to tell you that if it happened to a guy like Seguin, it happens all over the place. Happened all over Texas. King Ranch, Uchuria Ranch, all these major ranches you see in Texas. Believe me, some of those lands were stolen, either from Mexican Americans or other Americans or anybody, right? The idea that these major ranches were consolidated in one thing fairly is simple. But getting back on topic, Tijerina was fighting for federal land grant alliances to give this land back to the people who originally held it. And he was very successful. He got a lot of, he spoke out about education, about in the media for things like for Hispanics, right? Trying to make things better for Hispanics. But what made him famous internationally was he was responsible for an armed raid on a courthouse. And he was trying to free some Mexicans that were there, that were held there. But by the time he raided it, they were already let go and freed. And he was arrested. It was a big public thing. He was only in prison for a little bit. He was released shortly after because no one was hurt or anything like that. And he was still vocal, but not as much. He kind of dialed everything back a little bit, and that's where he kind of not fell off the radar, but he stayed on the radar. But he kind of, that's where his fame peaked, and then subsequently started to dwindle a little bit. It was after that raid, after he was arrested for raiding a courthouse, again armed. So again, not necessarily somebody that a lot of people will talk about, but he's an influential figure in the movement. Fought for land rights in New Mexico and places like that, real estate, getting people their homes back. Let's talk about Corky Gonzalez. Corky is his nickname because he's a boxer. He used to box. Poet, activist. Gonzalez is a critical member for the Crusade of Justice in Denver, Colorado. So he operated out of Colorado. And the thing about Gonzalez is he was specifically targeting the youth. He was a youth activist. He spoke to the youth. He wanted to set up institutions for young people to speak about liberation and justice and being activists, essentially. That's a picture of the Brown Berets. The Brown Berets think like Black Panthers, only less guns, more just like being tough and like being advocates for justice, right? I mean, you notice like these guys are not on, these young people, I should say, because the Chicano movement, more than any other movement, is a movement done by younger people. It's the younger generation. It's not so much the older, like there, to an extent it becomes that later on. But when it's starting, it's the young people, it's the kids, it's the high school students, it's the middle school students. Maybe not middle school, but it's definitely the high school students. So let me ask you guys, and I'll give you 30 seconds. I want you to tell me like in the chat. So think on it for 30 seconds and I want you to tell me, why is this civil rights movement predominantly being done by young people, right? Because like if we talk about African Americans, young people participated in that, but there was an older generation leading the way. Why are young people leading this one? Because they have parents and grandparents that live here, but why aren't the parents and grandparents leading it? Why is it the young people? So I'll give you 30 seconds. Think on that. Take a guess. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. I just want to hear what you think. About 20 seconds. Why do you think, send it private, public, doesn't matter to me, that young people are leading this movement? And that is time. So go ahead. Tell me what you think, chat. Let's go. Why is it young people? Let's see what we got here. Time is up. Send me what you got. Not quite. All right, so what I'm seeing is, well, let me explain this. A lot of these young people, their parents don't necessarily speak English. That's one. Two, these are the people who are, for the first time, kind of noticing and wanting this new change. And then three, to kind of wrap everything up, they're the ones who are, to an extent, being taught what America should mean and noticing that it's not meaning that, it's not living up to their promises, right? The idea that America is this awesome pie or cake with these great ingredients in it, but not everybody gets their fair piece at the right time. So that's part of it. It's all those things kind of mixed together. But let's talk about Texas. Let's talk about Gutierrez, and let's wrap this up. So from Crystal City, Texas, he's a professor, an activist, political advocate, a lawyer. Gutierrez was considered by many to be militant. He would consider himself militant. He called himself a Chicano militant, right, at all times. He started off small scale and worked his way up to state and national level. It started with school level protests, specifically towards like cheerleading practices that were discriminatory, where there was only one slot on the cheerleading squad for Mexican Americans and the rest of the slots were saved for Anglo Americans. And through protesting that, he organized things like walkouts. You guys know what a walkout is, right? Everybody gets up and at 11:03, we all walk out of class and we kind of disrupt the school. Things of that sort. Later on, when he got a little older, he was very instrumental in like voting rights and whether it's translating for people, getting things in Spanish near ballots, whether it was driving them to the voting booth, things like that. Very instrumental in that stuff. To this day, when I heard him speak a few years ago, by the way, him and Dolores Huerta are the only two leaders from this time period still around. The rest have passed away. But to this day, like if you hear him speak, he still hates Texas Rangers, like to this day, because they were the ones that gave him the most hassle. Trying to prevent him from helping people vote and doing things like that. It's kind of crazy. But that's a militant for you, right? And one of the major things he did on a national scale, especially, is he's one of the main leaders of something called the Raza Unida Party. And what the Raza Unida Party does is it was a political group that started at the state legislature and worked its way up that highlighted Mexican American needs as a valuable political group. So it was a Mexican American group, and it was all led by and controlled by and run with Mexican Americans. But for the years it operated, it's getting people into office, and it's working, right? Most of the people around Crystal City were Raza Unida members. Like all of it, it's working. It's getting stuff across. Now, in 1979, the group will be outlawed for reasons we won't get into here. But by the time the group is outlawed, the damage is already done. There's no repairing what they've done, which is show the other political groups that won't be outlawed, like Democrats and Republicans, that Mexican American voices are important, right? And that they have a powerful voice in the political system. They need to be listened to and utilized. So in that sense, the party, while it was outlawed and not destroyed, but ended, won a major victory for Hispanic civil rights in the sense that now, right, that's why presidential candidates always talk to the Latino vote, right? That's why in places like in South Texas and stuff, like candidates come down here. It's important. It's an important population that they need to speak to. And the Raza Unida Party is a major reason why most groups recognize that, because they showed in a very short amount of time how much political power they were able to amass as a little third party group. They weren't even one of the main parties, and they got all these people elected. So that is it for us. What we're going to do next is talk about our exit ticket, which is in Google Classroom. First one, very easy, explain and identify two ways that civil rights expanded from 1960 to 1980. The second one's a little more detailed, compare and contrast Hispanic civil rights to African American civil rights movements. Be detailed. When in doubt, write a little bit. Make sure that you have as much info in there as you can. If you have any questions, reach out to me through Teams. But other than that, guys, that is it for us.